My next question is, can you explain urban trauma to the audience?
Yeah, so urban trauma is a framework that I created a couple years ago and then wanted to put it into a book that could be a guide for people to be able to communicate what race-based trauma looks like. One of the reasons why I felt compelled to create the model was because I would sit around these tables, and I'm sure you sit around the same table with educators and mental health providers and, sometimes law enforcement. And it was always like, well, these kids are broken. These single-headed families and these mothers don't even show up to parent-teacher night, and these kids, all the diagnosis they got ADHD and they got this and that. And I'm like, while I was seeing children in treatment, what they were recanting to me were experiences that were rooted in racism. But they couldn't articulate that, right? Like, they didn't know how to articulate it. They were just telling me the story. Like, let me tell you what happened in class. But, when you have a trained ear to hear what racism looks like and sounds like and smells like and feels like, you're like, yeah, I know what this is, right? And what I was noticing was a pattern of the very same reactions, kid after kid after kid after kid. And I'm like, you know what? I gotta make sure that, our Black and brown community understands what this is, right? And I had to anchor it in history. And I'm not a trailblazer in that area. There are many historians that came before me, and I appreciate that, pay homage to them all the time, who have been able to capture the 400 plus years of traumatic history that happened, dating back to transatlantic. And that history carries on in the way that we see ourselves, in the way that we manage ourselves, in the way that this country has abused their power and privilege over the Black community. It has shown in the mental enslavement despite the freeing of physical bondage. And I wanted to be able to capture that as a trauma experience, a collective 400-year trauma experience, right? And so that piece was created. Then what happened is that I started digging more into, because I already know how people are. They're like, yeah, well, that happened 400 years ago, and I don't know why people got to keep, talking about it. It's over. It's not like that anymore. People are not slaves anymore. So I was like, okay, let me see if there's a biological or genetic factor that's at play here. And long and behold, right around 2017, a couple of years prior, they had started to do these studies around epigenetics. And basically, epigenetics identifies whether there is a particular gene that's associated with disease. Usually you could see it in terms of, you see these types of studies in cancer research or in diabetes and heart disease research. So epigenetics is not just for mental health or for trauma, but it did move over into that realm eventually. And what they found is that there is a trauma gene, and that trauma gene, when faced with consistent exposure to traumatic experiences and toxic stress, it is variated. It is not in its original form. And that variation of that gene causes health problems, educational problems, behavioral and social emotional problems. But no one is identifying that the reason why kids are behaving the way that they're behaving, and even adults, or the fact that their education or academic prowess is interrupted, is because this gene is running amok, in their DNA. And it is expressing itself behaviorally completely different. Then I also looked at what the continued environmental factors are. And I'm like, okay, when you got kids that are continually exposed either to, community violence or continually exposed to various levels of racism, whether it's from microaggressions by their teacher, all the way to being followed in a store, all the way to being, profiled by the police. All of these combined environmental factors causes traumatic stress into their nervous systems. And so and what that means is that basically they immediately go into a fight, flight, or freeze response. So I was like, okay. Then I started to realize, I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not just talking about historical trauma. I'm not just talking about biological trauma. I'm also talking about environmental trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So I'm like, this is like a culmination of 3 heavy areas of traumatic experiences culminating all into one person. And then what we want to do is be like, look how angry Black people are. I'm like, seriously? That's what we're deducing into? Nah, bro, let's go back to the science and take a look at that. And that's where the origination of urban trauma came up.
Wow. So my question to that is,